The sun was bright that morning, and the royal palace stood like a picture out of history. Its tall gates, golden details, and stone paths attracted hundreds of visitors each day. Tourists from every corner of the world came with their cameras, eager to see the royal guard and the proud horses that stood beside them. For many, it was a once-in-a-lifetime moment, something they would treasure in photos and stories forever. The guards were famous for their discipline. They stood tall in shining uniforms, never smiling, never moving, and never responding to jokes or comments from the crowd. Beside them stood the royal horses, majestic creatures with glossy coats and sharp, intelligent eyes. They were trained to remain calm, yet they were also strong and powerful, respected for their presence. Among the crowd that day was a man who had traveled from another country. He was part of a tour group, but unlike the others, his excitement showed in a different way. While some people admired the palace quietly and took photos respectfully, this man wanted to stand out. He wanted all eyes on him. His energy was loud, his laughter echoed, and he tried to show himself as the center of attention. Instead of simply standing with the group, he moved closer to the horse and guard. He raised his voice, cracked jokes, and started calling out to his friends in a playful yet careless tone. Other tourists began to notice him. Some frowned and shook their heads, sensing that he was behaving in a way that did not match the atmosphere of respect. Still, others, especially younger people in the crowd, giggled nervously. They pulled out their phones and began recording, expecting something amusing might happen. The man, encouraged by the attention, decided to go further. He leaned closer toward the horse, stretched out his hand as if he wanted to touch it, and laughed when the animal flinched slightly. The royal horse was trained to tolerate noise, sudden movements, and even the touch of strangers. Yet, like all living creatures, it had its limits. Its ears flicked back and forth, a sign of irritation. Its eyes shifted, and it lifted one hoof to paw at the stone ground. The guard, as disciplined as always, did not move, but his grip on the reins tightened slightly. This small gesture showed his awareness of the situation, though to most of the crowd it was too subtle to notice. The tourist, however, had no idea he was pushing boundaries. He took out his phone and began taking selfies. Instead of standing at a safe distance, he leaned his body toward the horse, making silly faces in his photos. He even imitated martial art poses, kicking one leg in the air and striking exaggerated stances to make his companions laugh. Every time someone chuckled, his confidence grew and he forgot where he was. Whispers began among the crowd. Some people, judging from his looks and the way he spoke, assumed he was Japanese. They murmured among themselves, "He must be Japanese. They are always so lively." Others argued, "No, maybe not." But the rumors spread quietly, and soon many around were convinced without even asking. This confusion would later play a bigger role in the story, but for the moment, the man enjoyed the attention without knowing what people were saying. The horse continued to show discomfort. Its head lifted high and its body shifted from one side to another. A few people in the front rows of the crowd noticed this and began to worry. They whispered to their friends that the man should stop before the horse reacted. Some even called out softly, "Please step back." But the tourist ignored them. He was too busy laughing and showing off. He bent down slightly and reached toward the bridle, perhaps without realizing how serious that action was. To touch the reins or bridle of a royal horse was not only disrespectful, but also dangerous. The horse jerked its head back slightly, and the guard's hand moved quickly to control it. A flash of authority passed across the guard's face, but he remained silent. Tourists gasped, realizing how close the man was to crossing a line, yet he kept going. He made funny noises, whistled, and clapped his hands right beside the horse's ear. The animal snorted loudly, its breath misting in the air. The sound was sharp enough to make some children in the crowd step back in fear. Parents pulled their kids closer, sensing the tension. Still, the tourist laughed as if he had won a game. His friends in the tour group tried to tell him to calm down, but he ignored even them. The palace gates had always been a place where respect was expected. Visitors often took photos quietly, sometimes even bowing in appreciation of the discipline and beauty of the guards and horses. But this scene was different. It was beginning to feel more like a show, and the crowd's energy shifted from enjoyment to nervousness. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. The guard finally shifted his posture slightly. Though he was trained not to react, he gave a small warning glance at the tourist. His lips pressed into a straight line and his eyes narrowed. Those familiar with the tradition knew this was rare. Guards almost never broke their stillness. But the man did not notice. He was too busy setting up another photo pose, standing only inches from the horse's face. The horse gave another warning of its own. It stomped its hoof hard against the stone, the sound echoing like a drum. Dust rose from the ground, and the sudden noise caused the crowd to jump back. For the first time, the tourist seemed startled. He stepped back slightly, but then, realizing people were watching, tried to turn it into a joke. He spread his arms wide as if to say, "See? It's nothing," and laughed again. But his laugh no longer carried the same confidence. By now, even those who had been amused at first were beginning to feel uneasy. Phones continued recording, but the voices behind the cameras changed from laughter to concern. "This is not good," one woman whispered. "He's pushing too far." Children clung to their parents while older visitors shook their heads in disapproval. The misunderstanding about his nationality continued in the background. People whispered, "That Japanese tourist is making a fool of himself." Others shook their heads and muttered, "No respect." The truth, however, was different, and it would soon come to light. As the minutes passed, the palace square felt heavy with tension. The man's actions, once playful, now seemed reckless. The guard's hands held the reins firmly, his expression never breaking, his posture still tall and commanding. The horse, though trained, could not be mocked endlessly. Its patience had limits, and those limits were now being tested. The tourist finally took a step closer again, perhaps thinking he had already proven himself brave enough. He leaned toward the horse one more time, holding out his phone for a close selfie. At that exact moment, the horse's muscles tightened, its ears pinned back, and its chest rose with a deep breath. The crowd froze, waiting for what might happen next. The scene at the palace gates, once full of curiosity and admiration, had turned into something else, a test of respect, patience, and control. And though no one realized it yet, this single man's behavior would become a story repeated far beyond the palace walls, carried by the voices of tourists, the lenses of cameras, and the endless memory of the internet. The horse's loud snort echoed across the courtyard, and the sound made everyone freeze for a moment. The tourist, who had been acting carelessly, jumped back in surprise, though he quickly tried to laugh it off as if nothing had happened. But his laugh was thinner now, and it no longer carried the same carefree energy. The horse had made its warning clear, and those standing close enough could see its ears pinned back, a sign of agitation. Parents held their children tighter, whispering for them to stay behind the barriers. The guard remained still, his tall frame unmoving, but the tightening of his grip on the reins showed that he was ready to act if needed. Instead of stopping, the man looked around and noticed that more phones were pointed in his direction. He mistook the stares for encouragement. His chest puffed up, and he spoke loudly in his native language, trying to make it sound like a performance. He moved in front of the horse again and raised his hands dramatically, as if he were preparing to perform a stunt. Some people chuckled nervously, but many more frowned. The uneasy feeling spread through the crowd, and what had started as a few silly actions now felt like something dangerous. The tourist bent down and clapped his hands near the horse's legs, a reckless move that drew a gasp from those nearby. The horse jerked its leg back slightly, and the metal horseshoe clicked sharply against the stone. The noise was enough to make several people step back in alarm. The tourist, instead of recognizing the danger, threw his arms out as if to say, "Look, nothing happened." He smiled widely, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of nervousness. He was trying too hard to appear fearless. Behind him, whispers grew louder. Some members of the crowd began saying, "He must be Japanese." They repeated the assumption, passing it from one person to another. The mix of accents and languages caused confusion, and soon many in the crowd believed it without question. Others disagreed quietly, but their voices were drowned out. Phones continued recording, and captions were already being added to live videos, labeling him wrongly as a Japanese tourist. The horse's breathing grew heavier. Its chest moved quickly and its nostrils flared. The guard remained silent, but his eyes followed every movement of the tourist closely. He was trained to remain calm, yet he also knew the horse's limits. The animal was disciplined, but not a statue. It could sense disrespect, danger, and chaos. Its training taught it patience, but that patience was wearing thin. The tourist decided to take it further. He pulled out his phone and turned on the front camera, holding it up high for a selfie. Instead of keeping distance, he leaned dangerously close to the horse's head, making exaggerated faces. He stuck out his tongue, puffed his cheeks, and made loud noises in an attempt to look funny on camera. The horse tossed its head suddenly, nearly knocking the phone out of his hand. The sudden motion drew a loud gasp from the crowd. Still unwilling to accept that he had gone too far, the man tried another trick. He stood tall and imitated martial arts poses again, swinging his arms and legs as if he were in a movie. He made sound effects with his mouth, shouting and clapping to attract more attention. But instead of laughter, his actions now drew silence. The crowd was no longer entertained. They were tense. Parents told their children not to watch. Some turned their cameras off, worried that they were witnessing a serious incident. The horse stomped its hoof again, harder this time. The sound echoed like a hammer against stone, and small chips of dust scattered in the air. The man flinched but forced a laugh. His friends in the tour group called out to him, telling him to stop. They tugged at his sleeve, warning him quietly in their own language, but he shrugged them off. He was caught in the trap of pride, too unwilling to back down when so many eyes were on him. The whispers in the crowd now turned into murmurs. "He is Japanese," someone said firmly, while another argued, "No, I don't think so." But the first opinion carried more weight, and many repeated it without question. The misunderstanding grew, spreading like fire in dry grass. The man himself, unaware of what people were saying about him, carried on, convinced that everyone was watching him for entertainment. At this moment, the guard finally moved. His boots shifted slightly on the ground, and he pulled the horse's reins firmly to steady the animal. Then, in a deep voice that startled the silence, he called out a warning. It was rare for the guards to break their silence, and when they did, it meant something serious. The words echoed across the square, commanding attention. The tourist froze for a second, his eyes wide. The crowd gasped. Even the children went quiet. But pride is a stubborn thing. Instead of retreating completely, the man tried to brush it off once again. He raised his arms dramatically, as if he had been part of a show. He smiled nervously, bowing slightly in mock respect, but his hands shook as he held his phone. The horse snorted again, stamping the ground with more force, and this time the tourist stumbled backward, nearly dropping his device. The energy of the square had shifted entirely. Where there had been laughter earlier, there was now tension so thick that people held their breath. The guard stood tall, his warning delivered, his face as stern as ever. The horse, though restless, remained under control, but its body language was clear. It did not want the man near. Some in the crowd began to call out, urging the man to stop. "Enough!" one older visitor shouted. "You are disrespecting tradition." Another said, "Leave the horse alone." But the man's pride made him deaf to their advice. He looked around and saw all the cameras still pointed at him. He was torn between fear and the desperate desire to appear brave. He decided to take one last chance. Stepping forward again, he crouched low, aiming his phone upward for a dramatic angle. The horse's head turned sharply, its ears flat, its muscles tense. The crowd gasped again, expecting something to happen at any second. The guard's hand tightened further on the reins, ready for the next moment. The man smiled weakly, his confidence fading, but he refused to walk away. He did not realize it yet, but every second he stayed near the horse, the situation grew more dangerous. The royal horse, with all its training and discipline, had already shown remarkable patience. But even the calmest creature has limits. The people around could feel it. They whispered to one another, their eyes darting between the horse, the guard, and the man who refused to stop. The misunderstanding about his nationality still colored their words. "This Japanese tourist is foolish," someone said. "He has no respect," another added. The truth was far from their assumptions, but in that moment perception mattered more than reality. As the horse pawed the ground once more, dust swirling at its hooves, the tension reached its peak. The crowd was silent, phones ready, hearts pounding. The guard stood tall, his voice waiting, his hand strong. And the tourist, still desperate to look fearless, leaned forward one last time, completely unaware that the next few moments would change everything. The crowd stood still, their eyes fixed on the tense scene at the palace gates. The tourist, who had spent so much time making fun and acting careless, was now face to face with the horse's growing anger. The royal horse, normally calm and steady, raised its head high and let out a deep, sharp neigh that startled even those who had been standing at a distance. The sound cut through the air like thunder, and the courtyard filled with gasps. Some people stumbled back, clutching their phones tightly. while others instinctively pulled their children away. The horse's body shifted suddenly, its powerful muscles tightening as its front hoof struck the ground again. This time the stomp was so loud that it echoed off the palace walls and dust rose into the air. The tourist jumped back, his wide grin replaced by a nervous expression. His phone slipped slightly from his hand and he fumbled to keep hold of it. What he thought would be a funny moment for the cameras had now become something much scarier. The royal guard, who had stood perfectly still until now, finally broke the silence. In a deep, commanding voice, he called out a firm warning to the man. The words rang out clear, strong, and full of authority. It was something tourists rarely ever heard, because the guards were trained to stay silent unless the situation demanded action. The crowd gasped again, realizing how serious the matter had become. Even the children fell quiet, their eyes round with awe. The tourist froze, his confidence shattered. For the first time, he seemed to understand that he had gone too far. His body stiffened and he stood awkwardly in the middle of the square, unsure whether to laugh it off again or finally walk away. Cameras captured every second and people whispered quickly to one another. Some said the guard shouted, "I've never seen that before." Others murmured, "This Japanese man is in real trouble now." The mistake about his nationality continued to spread, with almost no one realizing he was not Japanese at all. But pride is a heavy thing, and it did not let the man admit defeat so easily. His shaky hands lifted his phone once more and he tried to smile, forcing out a weak laugh. He bowed slightly, mocking the guard's warning as if it were part of a play. But his voice cracked when he tried to speak and his laugh sounded hollow. The people around him shook their heads. What had once been annoying now felt shameful. The horse, however, did not see it as a joke. It stepped forward slightly, its powerful hooves clanging against the stone. Its ears were pinned back tight and its eyes shone with intensity. The guard pulled firmly on the reins, his movements precise and controlled. The horse reared its head, neighing once again, this time louder and fiercer. The sound startled the tourist so badly that he stumbled backward, almost falling to the ground. His phone slipped from his hands, hitting the stone pavement with a clatter. The crowd erupted with noise. Some shouted in alarm, others in anger at the man's behavior. "Step back," one woman cried. "Get away from the horse." A man closer to the front raised his voice, saying, "Show respect." But the tourist stood frozen, his face pale, his mouth opening and closing without words. His earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by embarrassment and fear. Around him, phones continued recording, but now the videos showed a very different scene. What began as light laughter and mockery had turned into a moment of real danger. Clips were already being shared online, some with captions like "Japanese tourist angers royal horse," further spreading the wrong identity. People thousands of miles away would soon see the incident, believing the story without knowing the truth. The guard, standing tall and unshaken, gave another strong command, his voice steady and clear. This time the words were not just for the tourist but for the entire crowd. He reminded everyone of the rules. The royal guard and their horses were not to be touched, teased, or mocked. They represented discipline, history, and respect. His words carried such authority that even those who had been whispering fell completely silent. The atmosphere was heavy, almost sacred, as if everyone suddenly realized the seriousness of the place they were standing in. The tourist bent down quickly to pick up his phone, his hands trembling. He looked around nervously, realizing that dozens of cameras were still pointed at him. His face burned with shame. He tried to smile again as if to say it was all in good fun, but nobody returned his smile. The crowd's eyes were cold, filled with disapproval. His tour group stood a little apart from him now, unwilling to be associated with his actions. Even his friends looked away, their expressions heavy with embarrassment. The horse let out another snort, sharp and powerful, its breath steaming in the cool air. Its chest rose and fell rapidly, but it stood firm under the control of its rider. The guard gave a slight tug on the reins, steadying the animal. The discipline of both man and horse impressed many in the crowd. Some whispered incredible control, while others nodded in respect. The tourist, on the other hand, felt the weight of all those eyes. For the first time he seemed small, his earlier bravado gone. He shuffled back a step, his phone clutched tightly in his hands. His shoulders slumped and his head lowered slightly. Yet instead of leaving quietly, he still lingered, perhaps out of stubbornness, perhaps because he did not know what else to do. One child in the crowd tugged at his father's sleeve and asked softly, "Why is he making the horse angry?" The father shook his head, replying, "Because he forgot respect." Those words, though spoken quietly, carried the truth of the moment. The tourist shifted uncomfortably, his pride wrestling with his fear. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could speak, the horse raised its head once more and let out a sound so loud and piercing that it silenced the square entirely. It was not just a neigh. It was a roar of strength and warning, a clear message that enough was enough. The man stumbled back several steps this time, his face pale. He nearly collided with another visitor who quickly pushed him aside with an angry glare. The crowd had no sympathy for him anymore. Instead, their respect was with the guard and the horse who had endured his mockery for far too long before reacting. As the man retreated further, whispers began to change in tone. "He looks scared now," someone said. "He should be." Another added, "He made a fool of himself." Still, the mistake about his nationality continued, spreading in every direction. People shook their heads, saying, "The Japanese tourist embarrassed himself today," not realizing how wrong they were. At that moment, the square no longer felt like a place for laughter. It had become a lesson, one that everyone present would remember. The royal guard and his horse stood tall, symbols of dignity and discipline. The tourist, once loud and mocking, now looked defeated and lost. The air was heavy with silence once again. Children held their parents' hands tightly. Visitors lowered their phones, some out of respect, others because they no longer wished to record the man's shame. The guards stood unshaken, their horses proud and steady, while the crowd absorbed the lesson of the moment. Respect is not a choice, it is a duty. The man, his pride broken, finally took a step back toward his group. But the story was not over yet. The misunderstanding of his nationality, the videos being shared, and the judgment of the crowd would carry this incident far beyond the palace gates. And in the next moments, the truth about who he really was would begin to come to light. The courtyard was still tense after the horse's loud cry. The tourist, who had once been the loudest and most confident, now stood quiet and pale. His phone shook in his hands, and the laughter that had filled his voice earlier was gone. The crowd had stopped treating him like a joke. Now they only looked at him with sharp eyes filled with judgment. People whispered among themselves, and almost all of them repeated the same wrong belief. That Japanese tourist has no respect. The rumor had grown so quickly that it had turned into a fact in many minds. Not one person questioned it aloud, and the man himself had no idea what people were saying about him. Just as the tension reached its peak, a group of palace security officers stepped into the courtyard. They walked with purpose, their dark uniforms standing out among the bright colors of the visitors. The sound of their boots echoed across the stone ground, and the crowd quickly parted to make way for them. Everyone knew that when security arrived, it meant the situation had crossed a line. The once lively atmosphere of sightseeing had turned into something far more serious. The officers approached the tourist directly. One of them raised his hand, signaling for the man to step aside. His friends looked at him with wide eyes, urging him quietly to obey. But the tourist hesitated. His pride was still fighting his fear. He tried to smile, muttered something in his native language, and gestured toward the crowd as if to say, "I was only joking." The officers were not amused. Their expressions were calm but firm, and their tone made it clear there was no room for excuses. The man finally stepped aside, but his movements were clumsy. His hands shook as he tried to explain himself in broken English. He pointed to his phone and repeated, "Just funny, only funny." But the officers did not respond with smiles. They asked for his passport. At first he seemed confused, then reluctantly reached into his bag and handed it over. The officer flipped it open, his sharp eyes scanning the details. The crowd leaned forward, curious. Everyone wanted to know what would happen next. When the officer spoke loudly enough for others to hear, the truth was revealed. "He is Chinese," the officer announced. For a moment, silence washed over the square. Then came a wave of murmurs. People looked at one another in surprise, embarrassed by their mistake. "Chinese? Not Japanese?" they whispered. Heads turned, eyes widened, and the air was filled with awkwardness. The tourist himself looked down, ashamed. He had not realized that people were labeling him incorrectly the entire time. Now, not only was he embarrassed for his behavior, but he also carried the weight of a misunderstanding that had spread across the courtyard and was already being recorded in countless videos. The mistake about his nationality had made the incident even more confusing, and it would follow him long after the day ended. The officers explained the seriousness of his actions. Their voices were firm but calm. They told him that mocking or touching the royal guard and their horses was a violation of respect, not only to the men, but also to the tradition and history they represented. The horse was not a toy, not a circus animal, but a living symbol of the monarchy's discipline. The guard's job was sacred, and the horse's role was an extension of that duty. To make fun of either was an insult to the country itself. The man tried to defend himself again. He raised his hands and shook his head, repeating, "No harm, no harm. Only joke." His words sounded weak against the authority of the officers. They did not argue. They simply wrote down details from his passport, speaking quietly into their radios. The man's face grew redder by the second. His earlier confidence was gone, replaced by the heavy weight of shame. His tour group stood silently nearby, their expressions serious. None of them dared to laugh or support his excuses now. Meanwhile, the crowd shifted uneasily. Some people avoided eye contact, embarrassed that they had spread the wrong assumption about his nationality. Others still filmed, unwilling to miss the unfolding drama. Yet many lowered their phones out of respect for the guard and horse, recognizing that this was no longer entertainment, but a lesson in discipline and respect. The royal guard, who had been the center of attention at the start of the day, stood tall once more, his face unshaken. His grip on the reins had steadied the horse, which now stood calm again, though its eyes still watched the tourist closely. The horse's heavy breathing had slowed, its strength controlled by years of training. Together, the man and horse looked like statues of honor, untouched by the chaos that had unfolded around them. The officers gave the tourist a choice: leave quietly or face a formal fine. His shoulders sagged as he listened. His pride was broken, his face pale, and his voice low when he finally nodded. He agreed to step back with his group. The crowd parted again as he walked away, his steps slow, his head bowed. Every eye followed him. His phone, once his favorite tool for showing off, now felt heavy in his pocket. But even as he walked away, whispers followed him. "That Chinese man embarrassed himself," someone said. Others nodded, though some still mistakenly muttered, "Wasn't he Japanese?" The confusion was not easily erased. The truth was written in his passport, but the false rumor had already spread too far in the crowd. And worse, the videos labeled with the wrong identity were already circling online. By the time he realized it, it would be too late to correct them. As the tourist disappeared into the distance with the officers escorting him, the crowd turned back toward the royal guard and his horse. A wave of respect filled the air. People began to clap softly, not for the incident, but for the dignity shown by the guard and the strength of the horse. The sound spread, and soon dozens of visitors were applauding, a gentle acknowledgement of the patience and honor they had witnessed. The guard did not react, his face as still as stone. But the horse lifted its head proudly, as though it understood the praise. For those who remained, the story was already becoming something they would tell for years. They would say, "I was there the day a tourist mocked the royal horse," and their voices would carry both shock and respect. They would remember how quickly pride turned into shame, how misunderstanding spread like fire, and how dignity stood strong in the face of mockery. The tourist himself carried something heavier. For him, the memory would not be of clapping crowds or majestic horses, but of his own humiliation. What he thought was harmless fun had turned into a lesson he would never forget. The cameras had captured every second, and the world would see his mistake again and again. His identity, his behavior, and his shame would spread far wider than he ever expected. The palace gates returned to calm as the officers left with the tourist. The crowd settled, taking pictures again, but this time with quiet respect. The horse pawed the ground once gently, as if to remind everyone that it was not to be treated lightly. Parents whispered lessons to their children about respect, discipline, and the danger of mocking traditions. And though the sun still shone brightly, the air felt different now. It carried the weight of a story that would live long beyond the day. A simple act of disrespect had turned into a reminder that history, tradition, and symbols of dignity must never be taken as a joke. The tourist had been led away by the officers, and the palace courtyard slowly began to return to its usual rhythm. Yet the air was not the same. A heaviness lingered, a quiet reminder of what had just taken place. People who had been laughing and joking earlier now spoke in softer tones, almost as if the incident had given them a lesson they did not expect. Parents explained to their children why respect was so important. Tourists whispered among themselves, repeating every detail of what they had seen. Some felt pity for the man, others felt anger, and many felt embarrassed that they had joined in the laughter at first. But while the palace gates grew calm again, the outside world was already buzzing. Dozens of visitors had recorded the event on their phones. Videos were being uploaded instantly to social media platforms. Titles appeared like wildfire. Japanese tourist angers royal horse. Disrespect at the palace gates. Tourist mocked guard. Regrets it. The wrong nationality was stamped across every post, and it spread faster than the truth could catch up. Within hours, the video had gathered thousands of views. People across the world who had never even been to the palace were talking about the man, the horse, and the guard. Inside the palace, the guard and horse remained still, their discipline unbroken. The horse's chest had settled, its breathing even and steady once more. Its ears twitched as the sounds of the crowd returned to normal. Cameras clicking, children chattering, and footsteps shuffling across the stone. To anyone arriving later, the scene looked no different from any other day. But those who had witnessed the event would never forget it. They had seen something rare, the guard breaking his silence, the horse reacting with power, and a man's pride crumbling in front of hundreds. The tourist, escorted out of the palace grounds, walked with his head low. His friends stayed close behind, their eyes fixed on the ground as well. They whispered among themselves, but none of them spoke loudly. Shame hung over their group like a shadow. For the man himself, the weight was unbearable. His phone was still in his pocket, but now it felt like a curse. He knew every moment of his foolishness had been recorded. The pride that had once driven him to act out now burned as regret in his chest. He realized too late that what he thought would make him look brave and funny had made him look reckless and disrespectful instead. The officers, calm and professional, gave him one final warning before releasing him. They explained once again the seriousness of his actions. They told him about the traditions of the royal guard, the centuries of discipline behind their duty, and the role of the horses as living symbols of the monarchy's strength. They reminded him that mocking these traditions was not only disrespectful, but also dangerous. The man nodded silently, unable to defend himself anymore. He promised in a low voice that he understood, though his words sounded hollow. When the tourist returned to his hotel later that day, he finally checked his phone. His hands trembled as he opened social media, only to see his own face staring back at him. There he was, frozen in images and clips, clapping near the horse's legs, making silly faces in selfies, stumbling back when the horse reared its head. Each video had captions that labeled him as Japanese, and each one was filled with comments. Some mocked him, some criticized him, and some expressed anger. Disgraceful, wrote one. Have respect, wrote another. Many commented about how patient the guard and horse had been compared to him. His cheeks burned as he scrolled, wishing he could hide from the world. What hurt him most was the misunderstanding of his identity. He was Chinese, yet the world believed he was Japanese. The mistake spread so far that even when he tried to correct it online, his voice was drowned out. People did not care about the truth. They only cared about the story. The wrong label had already stuck, and his name became tied to it. It was no longer just a mistake in the courtyard. It was a mistake carried across the internet. Meanwhile, the videos that spread also carried another message. Though the tourist was mocked, the royal guard and horse were praised. Comment after comment admired their patience and discipline. Look at the guard's control, one person wrote. The horse is stronger than the man mocking it, another added. People shared the clips not just to laugh at the tourist, but also to highlight the dignity of the palace traditions. In an odd way, the man's disrespect ended up shining a brighter light on the respect others felt for the guard and horse. Days later, news articles began to cover the story. Journalists wrote about the incident, describing the behavior of the tourist and the reactions of the crowd. Some corrected the mistake about his nationality, pointing out that he was Chinese, not Japanese, but the correction came too late. The first impression was stronger than the truth, and many readers still carried the wrong idea. The tourist's shame deepened, knowing that no matter how much he wanted to explain, the story would never fully clear his name. Back at the palace, life went on. Tourists continued to visit, cameras continued to click, and the guards and horses continued their silent watch. But those who had seen the event carried the memory with them. They told their friends, their families, and their children. They spoke of how the guard's voice cut through the air, how the horse stomped its hoof in anger, and how the man's pride collapsed under the weight of respect he did not show. The lesson became bigger than the moment itself. One visitor, when asked later about the day, said softly, "I learned something that morning. Respect is not a choice, it is expected. If you forget it, you shame only yourself." Others agreed, repeating similar lessons. What had begun as one man's foolish attempt at humor became a story that reminded people across the world of the importance of dignity and tradition. For the tourist, the memory stayed heavy. He avoided watching the videos again, but they followed him wherever he went. Friends back home teased him. Strangers online criticized him, and even when he wanted to move on, the incident would not let him go. Over time, he realized that no excuse would change what he had done. He carried the lesson in his heart. Some places demand silence, some traditions demand respect, and some symbols should never be mocked. The horse, proud and majestic, became the true star of the story. People around the world praised its strength and patience, calling it a hero of discipline. The guard, too, was admired for his calm control, his rare warning voice adding weight to the moment. Together, they represented something larger than one man's mistake. They represented the timeless dignity of a tradition that would not be broken by laughter or mockery. And so the story lived on, passed from one person to another, shared in whispers at the palace gates, and repeated in headlines across the world. A simple act of disrespect had turned into a reminder that respect is not old-fashioned, not optional, but a living force that still shapes how we see one another. The man left with shame, but the guard and horse remained, tall and unshaken, symbols of strength that no foolish act could ever truly harm.